It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide, that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Joshua Earl Arnold. He's a professor of sustainable agriculture, part of WarrenWilsonCollege. And we're going to talk about sustainable agriculture. What does that mean? And his research. So, Josh, thank you for coming.
No, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, if you would, tell me about your background and, then the kind of work that you're working on right now.
Yes. I got really interested in food systems during my undergraduate studies and at UC Berkeley. And it's really interested in kind of the sociology of how people interacted with food systems and, how people made choices and all of those interesting social questions. And I got to UC Berkeley and started doing some undergraduate research. And I got onto a research project as an intern early on, where I was counting a lot of insects out on our crops, looking at crop pests and beneficial insects, and really fell in love with sustainable agriculture from the entomology side of things. Found passion for some of these things that we can do on the applied side. So I transitioned in doing my PhD research at UC Berkeley and specialized in biological control of pests and urban agriculture. The Bay Area is one of those unique places that has a long history of urban agriculture that's very much associated with social movements. And, most of those folks are out growing food without any kind of chemical inputs. So really interesting research questions in the context of how do we help urban farmers grow food in areas where the landscape is very complex and, they're not quite interested in, using pesticides and things like that. So
let's focus on that. The urban farmers, what are some of the challenges that they face? They just grow in in a closet, or they barely have any space, or what are some of the problems?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to differ by location, right? So depending on your country and, what city you're in, but there's a lot of social economic issues and also biophysical kind of issues, right? So most urban farmers are not growing food on land that they own, right? So they have security of tenure issues, and that definitely impacts practices, right? So if you are not sure if you're going to get kicked off your land, you're probably going to make certain decisions about what you're growing and how you're growing things. Oftentimes these sites are completely, funded on a shoestring, sometimes grant funding, a lot of volunteer labor, right? So, a lot of folks growing food to, address food security issues, but also that labor is also coming from folks that have food security issues. And then, a whole swath of biophysical issues. So, the fragmentation that we see in cities, when we see impervious surface, concrete buildings, freeways, et cetera, they change the way the landscape functions, right? So it changes how species of insects or mammals are moving through the landscape. It changes water cycling. It changes nutrient cycling, oftentimes. So we have documented issues of reduced nutrient cycling, reduced water cycling. And then in urban areas, most of the time what we see with, animals, whether they be insects or vertebrates, that are selected for urban tolerant species, right? So things that are able to stay around in those disrupted habitats thrive, So if you look around and you look at the birds, you'll see a lot of crows or a lot of house sparrows, but you won't see a wide diversity. And we also see some of those same effects on the insect side, right? So things that provide pollination or biological control services are all impacted by that fragmentation, ostensibly should be impacted by that fragmentation. So a lot of the sustainable agriculture practices that people use are really reliant on ecosystem services from soil building or from insects or from plants, from trees, et cetera. So these things are all, disrupted to some extent in urban areas.
So, okay, the people that are growing in urban areas, are they just individuals? Are they urban farms that are large? Like, who do you consult with and talk to? And again, what are the issues they have particularly?
Yeah. And I think that's very, it's variable as well, right? So on scale and also, management, you see a wide spectrum, right? So you have everything from, people growing in soilless systems, vertical systems, to people growing in, little patches of land, to, nonprofit farms to profit farms. So quite the diversity of production systems, which is to me really exciting. And as far as those issues go,
what are some examples and case studies? So there's not just generalities and stuff. Any come to mind?
So the cost of water is definitely one that is a challenge for folks. So water costs are quite high, and obviously you have to water crops. So most cities don't offer up agricultural kind of subsidies for irrigation. So water costs can be quite high. Kind of issues around, biological control of crop pests is quite interesting. We've seen a lot of different effects. So you see everything from, increased biological control of crop pests in gardens or small farms. And we call this the kind of urban island effect, right? If there's not a lot of rich and diverse habitat and spread throughout the city, the organisms that are still in the city might move to those areas, right? And use those areas more exclusively, might have more fidelity to those areas. And so, security of tenure, once again, is a huge issue. We did a big survey of urban farmers in Los Angeles, California, or Los Angeles County, and also in the San Francisco Bay Area region, these two high cost urban areas, to figure out how many folks actually owned the property or had, legal agreements with property owners that might keep them a bit more secure. And it's quite low. So less than 5% actually own the property they're farming. And then, a fair amount have leases, long-term leases, but the majority have very short-term leases or just memorandums of understanding with property owners, which means that their security of tenure can be quite tenuous. So those are kind of some of the large issues. We do see more pestiferous insects in urban agriculture, so more crop pests. And there's a lot of discussion about why this is, and it could be a variety of factors, including stressed urban plants, right? So with that reduced nutrient and water cycling, you might have urban trees or plants in the urban landscape that are stressed, right, and unable to mount particularly vigorous defenses against pest insects. You have a lot of what we would call rural areas, right? A lot of areas that are not managed. And so those could be sources for pest insects to infiltrate into urban farms and gardens. So you do have quite a bit.
There just might be no prey to prey on these pests. Maybe that's why they're proliferating.
Yeah, and that the impacts to those beneficial insects that are out there. So parasitoid wasps, spiders. Spiders is one that we've seen some documented declines in abundance and diversity. Obviously, anything that's ground mobile is probably going to have more difficult time getting around in an urban environment. You can imagine the little spider crossing the road. Things that are flying tend to do a little bit better. Ladybugs, parasitoid wasps, etc. So, impacts are going to be slightly varied, but generally speaking, pest insects seem to reach higher levels of abundance in urban areas.
But again, the people that have stable places to grow for a long term, what are their issues? What kind of things do they run into? What are some examples?
Well, I mentioned cost of water and then these increased levels of herbivorous insects in their gardens. Those are certainly issues that could be experienced from the biophysical side.
You mean obviously? Wait, so they have more insects, just fewer different kinds of them, or they have a problem with pests, but they don't? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, definitely more increased pest pressures in urban areas, right? So that idea about how urban areas that are particularly fragmented or impacted by urbanization, selecting for species that are urban tolerant, it does seem like herbivorous insects tend to fall further on the spectrum of urban tolerance, right? So they're able to persist for longer periods of time in these urban areas. And then these beneficial insects that we're talking about, that might be providing natural biological control, so we're talking about, social wasps and parasitoid wasps and ladybugs and other, predaceous beetles. These things, spiders, these things have a harder time moving throughout the landscape. So these pest pressures can be more intense.
And what about the growing itself? The fertilizer inputs or being able to get any kind of appreciable yield,
so that's
sun reaching them, et cetera.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. So, we spent 3 years looking at yields of urban farms in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we estimated that they are probably growing somewhere between about 17 to 30 pounds fresh produce per square meter. So a lot of production, right? So despite some of these challenges, folks are growing a lot of food, which is pretty amazing. And for the most part, they're reaching success by really intensive regenerative agricultural practices. A lot of compost applications, a lot of biodiversity. So a lot of intercropping systems where you're growing a lot of different plants in one area, a lot of crop rotations and cover crop. And so despite challenges, of costs of water and security of tenure and potentially some of these impacts to beneficial insects, folks are still overcoming and growing a lot of food.
What do you see as some of the challenges coming this year in particular? Anything that you've seen that's changed? I mean, there's a lot of talk of food shortages and supply chain problems. What are you seeing for urban farmers that they're going to have issues with?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really kind of showed us some of the value of urban agricultural production was COVID-19, right? So when COVID-19 hit and folks were seeing, grocery stores impacted, supply chains impacted, urban farmers really stepped up, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area and a lot of the farms that I studied for my dissertation research, and they produced a lot of food for folks in their community. We know that about 90% of the produce that's grown in these areas really stays pretty hyper local, right? So the folks that are working on the farms or live near the farms are associated with organizations that might be affiliated with the farms are typically the beneficiaries of what's grown there. And during COVID-19, they really shined, right? The community really showed up. And, a good example of this is Giltract Farm that is on UC Berkeley land in Albany, California. Students, school shut down and students went out there and community members went out there and grew food and started CSAs and started bringing, boxes of fresh vegetables to folks that were in need. So I think idea of urban agriculture is slightly shifted during this time period. And I think the value of it has started to change a little bit in people's eyes, especially in the context of these supply chain disruptions. Anecdotally, because these farms are using regenerative agricultural practices and practicing agroecology, the inputs required are somewhat minimal, right? So nutrient cycling on the farm is a really important aspect of a lot of these practices that people are employing. So I was talking to a farmer just this past week about fertilizer. He said, I didn't even know there was a fertilizer shortage because, I don't use any. So, there's a lot of different ways to manage nutrients on farms, especially in small farming systems. So,
well, quick question here. An urban farm, I would think they'd have a problem cycling their nutrients because let's say I need to do compost. Where am I going to put it if I don't have room?
yeah.
How would they, can they capture enough rainwater, let's say that, so they can lower their water bill? Like, I don't know. Do you think that urban farms have a better ability to cycle nutrients, or it's harder for them?
So I talked a little bit about soil conditions when I was talking about the challenges, right? So most of these farms do start on marginal urban land, right? So when we think about the areas that are, most devalued in the urban land cycle, those vacant lots that have, the tires thrown on them, or they're covered in weeds, or people haven't been able to build on, those are typically the areas where urban agriculture starts to shine, and there's certainly a challenge to starting the site, right? It's going to take a few years to probably get things up and running, but for the most part, most everybody is using compost and cycling nutrients on the farm, right? So, a good example of this is in Berkeley, California. A certain percentage of the municipal compost is given back to the community, right? So on those compost giveaway days, folks drive their trucks down in their cars and load up as much compost as they can and then bring it back to their farm or their small garden. But almost all of these sites are composting to some extent on the property, right? So where those practices really shine through, right, are in overcoming these reliances on external inputs, right? Even though, they might be growing food on some pretty marginal lands, right?
So again, is it harder for people to cycle nutrients, or is it easier? Or, what are the trade-offs you see with urban agriculture? What's it good at and why? And what's it have real difficulties with and why?
Well, I think I've answered the difficulties question to some extent, and
you have. I just wonder if there's any other things that jump out at you.
No, I mean, according to our research, my research personally, that's really access to land and access to water, and being able to financially sustain farms is really the big challenges, right? There's a lot of discussion about, where do these products come from, or where do these products go, and where does production go in the context of urban agriculture production?
Quick question here. Like around Christmas time, I see like Halloween, you see Halloween stores popping up in retail centers. That's fine. Christmas time, I see Christmas tree farms popping up on unused land on commercial parcels. So is anyone that you work with, have they developed a system to approach landowners, let's say churches or apartment complexes, or anyone that has a lot of unused land, and to, I don't know if it's called sharecropping, but to set up something where they can lease that land and grow stuff on it, and they don't have to go find their own land, and perhaps they could find stuff right in the city?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that is a strategy that a lot of people use. So city parkland, schools is definitely a community partner that we see have been very successful. Churches, also faith-based communities, have been very accepting of hosting urban farmers on their land. So those are the ways that oftentimes urban farmers do, approach some form of security of tenure, right? It is always a little tenuous though, right? Because the land in urban areas is always going to typically be valued by the highest and best use, right? So, and growing food on a half an acre in an urban core is not always going to be considered the highest and best use, right? So whoever does ultimately own that land is going to be able to make the decision about how its longevity, right? So you do see conversion of urban farms for development frequently, and that is part of that risk factor there, and yeah, I lost track of the previous question that you had there.
Well, sorry, this one kind of jumped in front, but so people do lease land from different places, churches, schools, etc. Is there any wisdom in how to do that the right way versus the wrong way? What makes that work for people that do it? I don't know if there's any any wisdom to be had about that.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I do know from interviews is that obtaining long-term leases is obviously preferable, right? So you do have some kind of legal footing and some understanding of how long you'll be able to be on that land, right? So long-term leases are certainly preferred in that context. Memorandums of understanding, don't have a lot of teeth legally, so those are not so preferred. And short-term leases are great, and sometimes that's how people start out, and sometimes that can roll into something that's a bit more long term.
Other issues that you see farms getting land obviously is an issue, but once they have something, it doesn't seem like the land they're on makes it too difficult to farm. I guess what is it? The economics of it makes it the most difficult. Are urban farmers tending to be homesteaders because they just don't have enough land and material to sell off excess produce to other people, or what does it look like?
Well, and this is kind of a greater question of economics, right? If what is the overall goal of the organization and the farm, right? So if it's a production farm, there's been quite a bit of legislation. Like if you look at California, Sacramento is a good case study for this. They've worked on allowing urban farmers to basically just pop up farm stands and sell produce, right off the farm. Some places you have to go through a little bit more red tape in order to sell things off the farm. But generally speaking, what we see is that production is not necessarily the main goal, right? Especially production in the context of profit. Right. The main goal is typically to address food security and to contribute to the community. Right. And also there's a lot of discussion about how, urban farms can contribute to people's access to the outdoors and, education in the context of bringing kids out to the outdoors. So it really comes down to, how folks are valuing what they're doing, right? And typically, nobody's out there, even though they're growing a ton of food, they're not out there trying to grow food for profit, right? Even though some might get sold off the farm, it typically does stay in the community.
Do you see urban farmers working together and kind of sharing produce? You grow X, I'll grow Y, so-and-so grows Z, and we trade? Or do they kind of work independently?
Yeah, that's definitely been a discussion in the context of, regional food systems, the idea of, how can folks work together to kind of create an economy of scale where they can potentially make enough profit to make the farm viable while also addressing those community food security needs. And a lot of times what we see is just a lack of infrastructure that's there to kind of support those kind of situations, right? So if you, think of a city that's got 10 different farms, you're going to, and they're all working together to grow certain things at certain times of the year to create an economy of scale and get things to market. You're going to need, food storage systems, food transportation systems, and those things typically side of being a bit too pricey for a lot of the folks that are farming at this scale, right? So that stuff's, we see some of that a little bit more on the peri-urban side or maybe the rural, side where folks are bringing food into the city. We see a little bit more collaboration that way, it seems. And I know that there's certainly urban farms out there that are working in concert, but for the most part, what you see is volunteer labor on these farms kind of just growing as much food as they can in the time that they have and getting it to their local community.
Okay. Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work, and where can, potential urban farmers or existing ones find resources to help them with whatever their issues are?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a great question. So there's just a ton of regional urban agriculture or agricultural resources depending on where folks are at. So it's really going to be place dependent, So reach out to your local urban farmers and talk to them and see what they need and see where they're getting resources from. A lot of land-grant universities have started to incorporate urban agriculture advisors into their extension programs. So certainly folks in larger cities with larger research institutions could be getting some help there. But generally speaking, it's going to be really regionally specific. There are a lot of organizations, Seattle has the P-Patch gardens, which is a really interesting model where the pea patches are funded by a local tax revenue. And that's certainly an interesting model that folks could, move towards, engaging with your local, government is certainly a way to impact the ability for urban agriculture to thrive over time. So I think those are all good advice. As far as research goes, boy, oh boy, we have a lot of folks that are out there researching urban ag at this point, so where can you find out more about my work? I'm now professor of sustainable agriculture at Warren Wilson College. So we're a little bit more rural here, and we run a animal operation and a row crop operation. And we're one of the federally recognized work colleges. So students run our farm and our vegetable garden. So, definitely reach out to local universities and colleges that are doing work in your community. And we have a lot of resources for folks out there and love to work with folks in the community.
Yeah. And last question, what are some of the topics that you've seen that are big in terms of research in urban farming?
Oh boy, we've spent a lot of time working on this idea about insects, right? And how insects are impacted by fragmentation. Certainly some of these biogeophysical kind of things like nutrient cycling and water cycling have been hot topics. There's a lot of good folks out there doing work on that. So Stacy Philpott's lab at UC Santa Cruz has been really instrumental. Both her and Monica Egger, who's now out in Munich in Germany, they've been really pivotal in addressing and researching a lot of these impacts to insects in these systems. There's a lot of things to be done and a lot of issues to be addressed. A lot of folks are kind of thinking about this idea of moving towards soilless systems in urban areas, right? And, what do these vertical farms look like? So I think there's going to be a lot of interest around that and a lot of research that needs to be done on that. I'm a big proponent of urban farms that produce a lot of ecosystem services, habitat for animals and clean the air and help with nutrient cycling and connect to their community. And so far, a lot of the vertical soilless systems seem to be very closed off, right, and very contained. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about what those look like in urban areas and whether or not they're actually going to address food security, right? So we've seen a lot of, multi-million-dollar vertical operations go into operation, and they're still after, a decade just growing lettuce that's getting sold at Whole Foods, So, there's going to be a lot of discussion around that moving forward. And I think whether or not that's appropriate and what kind of impact that has to the urban landscape is going to be a pretty salient discussion.
Well, very good. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing what you all are up to. And, anybody can find me out here at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina.
Excellent.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are one or two useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about the Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.